Hello and welcome to the second video covering market failure in the A-level. In this video I just want to be really clear. What I'm doing here is aiming to cover the differences between the AS and A-level spec, so please do have your AS notes to hand and never forget the importance of this area. You must recall your AS notes because the essay, pair and context have often included market failure questions. So there's a very high likelihood that this will come up in your A-level exam. Also, the OneNote contains loads of videos that I selected on market failure, so please do get involved on those as well. So what are we looking at here? Well, this is 418, and please feel free to pause the video at any point so you're able to take notes. 418 then looks at the market mechanism, market failure and government intervention. There is one slightly new section here on 4181, and although you'll be familiar how the price mechanism works in a private market or in a product market or a labour market for that matter, we're having here a look at a product market and looking at the price mechanism. You might recall this from AS, from your AS spec, and that is the price mechanism works because it has some key functions. Three of those functions are right here. The price acts as a signaling function because the price provides the crucial information to the participants in the market. And that's why it acts as a signal, and that becomes the first moment when when perhaps the individual, either the seller or the buyer, has the incentive to act. So the signaling function is kind of the first thing that takes place within the market. It provides the crucial information. The second thing is that the price creates the incentive for the participants to do something. So if the price rises, then we can assume that suppliers would want to supply more to the market. If price lowers, we can assume that that creates an incentive for consumers to buy it or buy more of it. But price also acts as a rationing function. If the price increases, it will eventually help to clear the market. So if we have excess demand for a good, the price will rise until demand meets supply, and thereby only the people who are willing and able to buy it will be able to get that good, and the price clears the market. Otherwise, we'd be left with excess demand. Okay, so therefore the scarce resources are rationed between those that can take part in the transaction. So the price has three key functions: a signaling function, providing information; the incentive function, because the price incentivizes both parties to actually do something; and then it rations the resources. The price will rise and fall so that the market always clears and the resources are efficiently allocated. Now that is the main advantage of the price mechanism. It should be a really effective and efficient means by which our scarce resources are well allocated. However, there are some problems with this. The key problem with the price mechanism is that if any of these functions break down, then we have an issue. So the key one really is the signaling function. If I don't know your price, or there's some sort of imperfect information, then the signaling function may not occur, and therefore it won't act as an incentive for people to do something. This will mean that the market fails, of course, and the market can fail for a number of reasons. And you'll go back through your AS book and look at public goods and demerit goods, etc., etc. The market isn't always an appropriate means by which resources can be allocated. You should also be aware that the market does not always cover all the costs of a transaction, because of course the private costs will be covered of the supplier and the private benefits will be considered by the consumer, but any extra costs or any extra benefit from this transaction will not be considered by the private market. So the total cost or total benefit isn't considered. That is again another problem or a con with the price mechanism as a means to allocate resources. We can also argue whether it's appropriate that the price mechanism allocates resources. For example, it's the price mechanism. If I go over here, a couple of examples here. If I just click on this a moment, the price mechanism is what has determined the fact that Britain sells weapons to Saudi Arabia. And of course that they're now being used, as it says here, against civilians in the war in Yemen. So should the price mechanism really have decided that those weapons should have gone to Saudi Arabia. Likewise, the price mechanism and the fact that the price has acted as an incentive here has created this quite black market here, this really perverse market of Somali traffickers who are selling Somalis organs in Egypt. Now, this article is not for the faint-hearted, so if you do look it up, please be warned, and I'm not going to scroll down too far. There's some quite horrible pictures on there. But in essence, you know, the buyers from Egypt would not have met the suppliers from Somali without the price mechanism acting efficiently and acting as a signal, acting as an incentive, and therefore rationing, you know, where these organs will end up. So again, is the price mechanism really appropriate for deciding where these resources go? I'm going to head back to the slides now. The next section is on the meaning of market failure. This you would have seen before, so I'm not going to cover that again. That's all in the AS. 4183 again is largely in the AS, but I have included a short video from Econ Plus Style, just a 5-minute video for you to have a look at, just to remind you about public goods and quasi-public goods, so please do check that out. The one new element in 4183 is what's called the tragedy of the commons, and this is where individuals pursue their own private profit or their own private benefit in the short term without recognizing the impact of that in the long term. So and therein leading to a situation where they can no longer privately profit. So there's a good example here from I think it was a textbook I found somewhere along the way. But here we have farmers keeping cattle on land which they yield a profit from. But the land is collectively shared amongst various farmers, and as we assume that each head of cattle produces a profit, we can assume therefore that that's acting as an incentive for farmers to get more cattle on this land. But of course what they're not considering is the long-term effect of more and more cattle on the land. They're only considering their private profit. And what of course happens then is the land becomes ruined, the resources is gone, no longer of use, and therefore so is the opportunity to make the private profit. So they've taken a short-sighted view and of course ruined themselves in the longer term. Similarly, the ozone layer has been affected by the tragedy of the commons, because in a short-sighted view we're all using CFC sprays and various harmful chemicals from air conditioning units and aerosols to get some private benefit. Firms obviously selling them to make a profit, individuals using them to smell nice or to feel cooler in the terms of the air conditioning unit. But what we're not considering is the impact on the ozone layer, a shared resource here. And because we're not considering that now, the ozone layer of course has a hole in it and harmful rays come through, and we're now harming ourselves because yet again we chased a personal profit in the short term, ignoring the long-term impact. And of course, we are the victims. So it's the tragedy of the commons. All right, everyone thinking as individuals, no one thinking as a collective, and obviously each individual then suffering in the longer term. The next section here is on positive and negative externalities. That's 4184, and you would have seen a lot of this before. The key difference here is that we have to consider marginal analysis. So we really shouldn't be doing supply and demand diagrams. We need to be considering marginal diagrams. So let's just have a quick refresher here. When we look at a market marginally, instead of a supply curve, we would use the marginal private cost. And you can see there, private costs are the cost to an individual or firm of the transaction undertaken. Likewise, the demand curve is actually a reflection of the utility a consumer will get through the purchase of this product. So the private benefits there are the financial benefits to an individual or firm of an economic transaction undertaken by that individual. Okay, so marginal private benefit. That would be the demand curve. Now, the assumption we make here, and one of the problems with the price mechanism, is that the individual firm is only considering their private cost and the individual buyer is only considering their private benefit. when making a transaction. So we can see the transaction occurs when those two things are in equilibrium. MPB equals MPC. But of course that's not the end of the story. I said before that the price mechanism doesn't consider the total costs or the total benefits of a transaction. So let's have a look at those. Here then we have to consider the social costs and social benefits. And we can see here that marginal social costs reflect the total cost of a transaction. So we have the private costs to the firm plus the external costs of that transaction. Together they create the social cost. Likewise, the marginal social benefits reflect the total benefits of a transaction. So we have the private benefits considered by the individual buyer plus the external benefits. Once you put those two together, you have the social benefits. And where we would be most allocatively efficient is where we have a quantity of goods that is being sold and bought, where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit. That's the amount of units that we want to have been produced or consumed within the market, not the MPC or the MPB, unless they happen to be the same as the social benefits, and therefore there are zero external benefits and zero external costs, in which case the MPC would be also the MSC. Okay, but that's quite rare. There are usually some sort of externalities being created. If I move on then to the next slide, let's look at a quick example here. So if the price is allocatively efficient, it must cover the private cost and the marginal external cost. If it does, then we would say that the cost has been internalized into the transaction. Okay, it's no longer external to the transaction, it is internalized into the transaction. So MPC plus MEC equals MSC. And a quick look at those numbers there. £3 pollution caused when producing 1 unit. So there is an external cost of producing whatever this product is. Okay, so you could argue we should really be setting £18 for this particular product, because that would then internalize the external cost into the transaction. Of course, the firm only sees the £15 private cost, and therefore would want that covered, not necessarily the extra £3 of pollution that's been caused. So why does the firm why is the firm not bothered by that £3 additional external cost? Well, that is because of this, and this is brand new to the A-level spec, because of property rights. The property rights have not been allocated to wherever that air has been polluted. So if you've polluted the air, no one owns it. So therefore, no one's chasing you for compensation. It's not your air, so you're not harming your own air. And of course, the tragedy of the commons would say that if we continually do this over time, the air would be so polluted we couldn't survive, perhaps. And therefore, our short-sighted pursuit of profit has, ignored the long-term impact of an air, creating such a polluted airspace that we can't actually survive. It's quite a far-fetched example, but of course the point is there. That could be the tragedy of the commons. So here, because no one has assigned property rights, then no one owns the air that's been polluted. So that £3 isn't being chased by anyone. So let's imagine if the air was owned, and therefore someone would own it and would have property rights on it. Then if you have ruined my air, then I would seek compensation for you, and the marginal external cost would be considered. Okay, and in this case it would be considered through compensation. So assigning property rights is quite important to helping the external costs that are produced, mainly through production, actually be considered within the overall transaction, or in other words, it would help internalize all the costs into the transaction. Now that's the end of the second video. I want to stop there just before we get into some of the actual marginal analysis here, which continues from slide 14 onwards. Thank you.